Today is September 11th, 2024. My name is Blair Williams, and I'm here at the Cumberland County Historical Society with Merri Lou Schaumann. So thank you, Merri Lou, for agreeing to talk today.
You're welcome.
Um, so one of the first questions I always like to ask is, we'll get to my first question in a little bit, but so the first question I'll ask you is, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a suburb of Cleveland, Euclid, Ohio. It was a working class factory town on Lake Erie. My grandparents were from Transylvania.
Mm-hmm.
They were Saxons. Transylvania is now in Romania. But in the Middle Ages, Saxons were encouraged to settle in that area, which was Transylvania, to build fortified cities. In fact, 7 of them. That's why it's called Siebenbürgen. So really, my cultural influence really was from Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
My grandparents lit real candles on their Christmas trees. And I think all Transylvanian men, Saxon men, had to learn how to play pinochle because my grandfather taught us pinochle when we were very young. I went to high school. I was an average student who liked to have a lot of fun. I had one sister who was honor society and very quiet, and I was just the opposite. And we couldn't stand each other like most brothers and sisters. But we speak to each other every day and are the best of friends.
Mm-hmm.
My father left the family when I was 8 and my sister was 5.5. We never saw or heard from him again. That was the year my mother was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The doctor told her she had 2 years to live, and she said, "I will see my children grow up." And she struggled through hospital visits over the years, having to work in a factory, even though she graduated second highest in her high school class. But I had a good childhood. My mother died when I was 19 and my sister was 16. And we have lived on our own ever since. One day, not long after my mother died, I said to my sister, who was still in high school, "Would you like to go to Hollywood High?" And she said, "Okay." So we took our car, and because we'd never been any further than New York City, we went to California by way of Washington, D.C., Florida, across the South to Hollywood, where I rented an apartment. And about 5 days later, I decided this was just too much to handle for me. So we threw our things in the car and we set out to go back to Ohio. Problem was, we didn't have a home to go to, but we set off and we got gas right after we left Hollywood. And we were talking to the man who filled our gas tank, and he said, "Where are you girls going?" And we said, "Back to Ohio, but we only have $16. And he said, "You'll never make it back." Well, so that night we slept on some mountain side with a bag of Oreos and some Pepsis because we were teenagers. And the next morning we set off. We were driving through the edge of the desert when I drove by and I said to my sister, "Look, there's 2 guys hitchhiking to Akron, Ohio." And I kept driving and I slammed on the brakes and I backed up and we said, "Get in." And they're the ones that drove us all to Ohio. I think we made it in 3 days. I was scared to death because they drove so fast. but at least they had money to put in the gas tank. We never, slept anywhere at night except in the car. But again, we're teenagers. We got back, dropped them off near Akron, went to the gas station because I was just about on empty, and I asked the attendant, could you please give me 25 cents worth of gas? And he said, where are you going? And we said, Cleveland. So he put $1 in our gas tank, and we got back to Cleveland or Euclid that night. And from then on, for a few months, we stayed with friends of my mother's. But eventually, I had to get a job, and we got a place to live. I remember going shopping for food for us with $1.50. And my sister and I survived on creamettes, which are elbow macaroni and margarine, and frozen dinners for Thanksgiving. We had frozen Swanson turkey dinners. And a friend's father ran into us in the grocery store. And he asked us what we were doing for Thanksgiving. And when he saw we had frozen dinners in our cart, from then on, he brought us a box of food occasionally because he said he cried when he went home and told his wife. But again, we were survivors, my sister and I. She graduated from high school, and she was an honor student and was off to Ohio State. And I had several friends who were guys that were going to Kent State. And my sister says, I don't want you to come to the same college as me. So I went to Kent State. I was just an average student. But in Ohio, if you graduated from high school, you could get into college on maybe with conditions. That's where I met my husband, who was from York, Pennsylvania.
Well, I should ask, what year did you start attending Kent?
Start attending college?
Yeah.
I was 21 because the money really did not come in until then. And I remember Kent was on quarters, and it was $128 a quarter to go to college. It was a wonderful experience. I enjoy so much living near Dickinson College. And I always love it when the students come back in the fall because it reminds me of my experience. And I think what was so wonderful about college was it opened a whole new world to me, that I wasn't just there to get an education so I could get a job. I was there to learn about art and history and other things. I met my husband. We got married. He was still in school. And one day he said to me, I think it was in his junior year, the end of his junior year, he said he wanted to go to law school. And so he decided to apply to a school named Dickinson in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And one of the things my mother was very proud of was when we were growing up, she bought a set of road book encyclopedias, the 1956 edition, I think. And I carried those with me. I pulled out the encyclopedia P for Pennsylvania, and I can still see myself standing in the living room of our apartment and looking up Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and saying to my husband, do you know they had an Indian school in Carlisle? What is that? Little did I know how I would spend most of my life, the rest of my life, knowing about the Indian school and being involved in certain things. And would go to a sweat lodge and be involved in a powwow. So that's how I got to Carlisle. And how I got involved in the Historical Society and history really was when I got to Carlisle, I had a bicycle. And I would put my daughter in the little seat on the back, no helmets, no straps, no nothing. And we would cycle around Carlisle. And I saw all these wonderful old houses and buildings. Euclid was a suburb of Cleveland, so I had seen nothing like this before. And I wanted to know who lived in all these houses and what did they do? Well, I wanted to do a little bit of volunteer work. And after my mother died, I had worked at the Anti-Tuberculosis Society in Cleveland. And I noticed that they had one in Carlisle. So I called them and nobody ever answered the phone. So my father-in-law, who was involved with the Historical Society in York, said, why don't you go to the local Historical Society and volunteer? That's how I got involved here. And when I walked in to volunteer, there was one employee, the librarian, Kit Brock. She was about this high. Her husband was a taught at Dickinson. And she said to me, you know, people write us and ask us for information about their families. How would you like to do some research for them? Sure, fine. And then I realized I needed to teach myself genealogy. So I went to Bosler Library and got a book out on how to do genealogy. And that's how I got started.
I was going to say, so I know how we do genealogy research today, which is sort of built on a lot of the foundation that you and some of the colleagues, I think, who have been here have sort of laid in terms of, your, but especially, the work that we'll probably talk about a little bit later. But what was genealogy research like when you first started in the early 70s?
Well, again, because I was self-taught, I didn't know what I should and shouldn't do. I just followed my instinct, and I wanted to look at primary records. At that time, the courthouse, you could walk in several doors. There was no security. You could go to the basement of the court, each of the offices in the courthouse, and sit for hours. Nobody checked you in, nobody checked you out. And so I started to get familiar with the county records. The first two books I published, self-published, were books of tax lists. The only tax lists that were available to most people at that time for Cumberland County in the 18th century were in the Pennsylvania Archives, the published series of the Pennsylvania Archives. And I realized that there was a gap. So I sat down in the basement, and I think you could still smoke at that time, which I did, with the records, just writing along, and I hand copied hundreds of pages of tax lists and had them printed by a local group and mailed them, and they were purchased by libraries all over the country. And then I would do genealogies for people. Those were the days before computers, and I hand wrote all the reports. My husband, being a lawyer, said, get a retainer, which was probably like $5. But anyway, that's how I started. And then they had a magazine called Genealogical Helper, and people advertised in that, which I did. And I began doing genealogy, and the more I looked into the county records, and of course, there were so many records here, published books and maybe church records, not the amount, obviously, that the society acquired over the years. But I discovered that there's nothing better that I like to do than research. I love trying to solve a problem, which is finding someone's relatives.
Mm-hmm.
And one year, a writer came doing an article on Molly Pitcher. He was a historian from New Jersey. And he asked me to do research for him, which I did because I was really familiar by that time with the county records. And he said to me, one day you won't be satisfied with just finding birth, death dates, and marriage dates for people. You'll want to know how people lived then. And if all goes well, he'll turn into a historian. Well, I guess he was right. And Molly Pitcher has been the biggest annoyance or frustration for me ever since the 1970s. There's some misinformation about Molly Pitcher, and one of the things is that her son's middle name, nobody knows. It's the initial L. And older historians always thought it stood for Ludwig, and they had her husband's name wrong. I have looked at tens of thousands of documents over the years with this purpose in mind. Always, when I'm looking in other research, always, I will find out what that L means. It's 50 years later, and I still don't know. Anyway, so when I started volunteering here, Terry Nickey had just graduated from college the year or two before, and John Fralish was here, and the three of us began giving genealogy workshops. The television show Roots had come out, and everyone was gung-ho to know more about their families. And I remember Henry Young, who was a local historian and genealogist he taught at Dickinson, was the first chairman the first year, which was, I believe, 1975. And we had 125 people for the first session.
Wow.
And then I think I took over as chairman the next year. And then John and Terry would also give talks with others. At that time, at the society, the people on the board were historians. There was Robert Grant Christ and Warren Gates, who were all professors. And it was delightful to hear their lectures, although lots of times they went over my head. But it was delightful to be involved with them. It's changed a lot since then, obviously.
Well, I'm wondering too. I mean, that's the time that I think Roger Steck became involved, and John and Wilson O'Donnell and
Yes.
A third person were hired as sort of like the first sort of professionalized staff.
Yes. The mid-70s were quite interesting. Again, Wilson O'Donnell, we had a new librarian, and that was, I am going to look at my notes.
No,
Okay. In 1977, Jake Myers was a county commissioner, and he loved history. And he came up with a great idea. He thought, let's sell all these county records. They're old. We need some space. Let's sell them to the public, and everybody could own a piece of history. At that time, Harriet McCrae, I'm not sure if she was on the board, or she may have also been a librarian at that time. We went over on a hot summer day to the old courthouse, went up the steps to the belfry, and there, stuffed in the lath in the walls, were all these wonderful old documents. And I hate to say they were piled on the floor. You could walk on them. I remember pulling a document out of the wall, and I said, look, this is a license asking for a tavern, if they could have a tavern license. And we went back to the Historical Society, and Harriet McCrae, who was well known in the community and well respected, got in touch with the commissioners and several other people. And she said, you can't sell these records. None of this had been microfilmed. Mm-hmm. And through her efforts and a grant, a federal grant, there was lots of money at that time for preservation and the arts and things. And with a federal grant and with money from the county commissioners, CCHS was able to hire several people, including myself, Terry Drogbar, who's a local historian. And we sat and unfolded these filthy documents, because you can imagine being up in a belfry in a basement and how dirty they were, unfolding them, cleaning them, sorting them, and eventually the librarian put them in categories. And John Fralish, who has the most beautiful handwriting and printing that I've ever seen, labeled the folders. And this is where they stayed for another 20 years, I believe. Some of them went out to the county home, where I believe the cleaning lady was in charge of them. And then they got moved to the old jail before the county created an archives out on Allen Road, which is where they are now. But people ask me, how do I know so much about local history? And it is because I've had unfettered access to them since the 1970s. And I think one of the major reasons is that you were just able to look through documents. Now, the archives are preserved, they're conserved, they're being put online. But I don't have free access, and neither does anyone anymore. And that's how you discover things. Now you say, I would like to see the inventory of so-and-so. In those days, I didn't know what insolvent debtor petitions were. I didn't know what kind of information was available, but I was able to discover that because I had free access. I think it's a great thing that the archives, that the county is paying staff to make these records available, because they are primary sources that have never been indexed. I mean, scanned or microfilmed. So, what else would you know?
Well, so in your notes, you said it was Mary Hertzler.
Yes.
All right. Not Harriet McCrae.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It is Mary Hertzler.
Mary Hertzler.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I know one of the books that I use quite a bit here in my own research for patrons, and that we're constantly pulling out, is your work on the taverns of Cumberland County. from what, 1750 to 1840, thereabouts. Was that project inspired by you going into the Belfry and seeing that first tavern lessons, or
Um,
or
sure. Well, the Historical Society started publishing a heritage series,
yeah,
and they started with Paul's
Paul Gill,
thank you,
yeah,
Paul Gill's book on bridges, and they did one each year, and they sort of were looking for topics, and I said, well, you know, we have all these tavern licenses, and I'd love to do something about it because I really loved architecture
yep,
and I loved research. And we have a run of all the old newspapers. Um, so they said, go ahead. And of course, all this was done free. No one was ever paid to do any of the county heritage books. But my children were in high school or grown, and I had the time. That's why I've been able to write so many books. I had the time. It involved me looking through all the newspapers that we had from the 18th century to about 1840, twice. And driving, lots of the tavern petitions, they would say, I'd like a license for my house, which is 6 miles from Carlisle on the Walnut Bottom Road. So I'd get in the car and drive 6 miles and see what was there, to try to figure out. Somebody asked me once, what book did you use to identify all these taverns? I said, there wasn't a book. There were the documents and the newspapers.
yep.
And again, I'm always interested in telling a story. And so I did research in published books, and so tried to find diaries and journals of people who had traveled through Cumberland County and had written about it and had talked about the taverns that they stayed in. So that's how I got the information for the book. But I guess one thing that I'd like to mention is the book that I did earlier.
Oh yeah, it was nice.
The history of I am bad at thinking of titles of books. I spent years and years in the courthouse looking up deeds because, as I said, when I first came here, I wanted to know who lived in these houses and who built them.
Mm-hmm.
So I would sit at the back section of the recorder of deeds, probably smoking a cigarette, which we could do then, filled with people researching, you know, for real estate transactions. And I just kept pulling down these books. It was good darn exercise, pulling down these great big volumes of books and tracing. Carlisle was laid out into 312 lots. So I had 312 lots to trace from 1751 when Carlisle was founded. And I stopped at 1835 or so, because that's when so many of the lots started to be divided into half.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only so much I could do and how big I could make the book. And so I called it A History and Genealogy of Carlisle because I had a little section in the back that covered the names of some of the original lot owners. And I also think it's really important to have signatures. And so when I did a revised edition, signatures are very easy to come by. People had to sign lots and lots of things during their lives. And that's what I included in the revised division. But the nicest revised edition, the nicest compliment I've ever had is to have people say how much they were thankful that I wrote that book. Henry Stewart once said to me that he thought it was the best book ever written about Carlisle. I didn't necessarily agree with him, but I was glad for the compliment.
Yeah. Well, I would say we always tell people when they come in to do property research, and I'm always so happy when they're looking at something in that original sort of, site plan for Carlisle, because I know I have your book, which gives that, first, 70 years. We have so many maps,
Yes.
so many photos. It's so much easier because of all the work that has been done already. And then we also get the people who are looking at, this random farmhouse in, North Newton Township. And it's like,
I know.
just throw your hands up. And, but because of the work that you've done, it makes my job a lot easier. So I'm very thankful.
Good. And Carlisle has always been, obviously, a love of mine. It's a second home. When you have no parents after, when you're a teenager and leave, you have no place to go home to.
Mm-hmm.
And once we left to go to college, that was it. And Carlisle really felt like it was home for me, and it still does. And that's why I have just published a social history of Carlisle. It's beginning 1749 to 1759. I'm not doing a plug for the book because I don't get paid, but it will be reviewed in the journal and people will be able to buy that. And it was a real passion of mine, and the research took me over 40 years. I kept collecting things and decided that I better publish it now because I'm going to be 80 next week. And in case I got run over by a truck, I didn't want all my research to get thrown away.
Well, so I was just trying to get the question in my head straight. But so in addition to the history and genealogy of Carlisle, the tavern book, social history, you've published sort of similar to those first couple books that you worked on with the tax list, some of the transcriptions for pauper children and whatnot. Was that just at the behest of the Historical Society later on, or was that something that you just felt like would be useful for future researchers?
Yes, I felt it would be useful, and no, I wasn't asked to do it. It interested me, and I thought it would be useful. That's why I do research. Well, I must admit, before I came here today, this morning I watched a documentary on the ice mummies in Mongolia, because I just love anything, just like my research. I love when people are searching for information. And the whole thing is, the reason I've always wanted to do things for the society and be available, because I want to share it with other people. What's the point of having information and information that would help other people if you don't share it?
And I know, my colleagues, agree. It's because of, again, the work that you've done, that John Fralish has done, and others, that early time period in Cumberland County is so much easier to research than, like the 1800s, just because of all the indices and, that people have created, where you're not constantly searching through every township and municipality for a name, because you can just go to the back of the book and look at that index.
Well, and now I've found in the last decade or so, it's easier sometimes to search earlier than it is to search near in the 20th century. I'm talking, 1900 on or 1920 on. Maybe those records aren't available although Ancestry.com, obviously, and newspapers.com has changed.
Yeah.
Has changed everything.
Man. Well, I know we're getting away from your notes a little bit too, but
that's fine.
One of the things that I am also very appreciative that you've done, for this interview is going up on the Gardner Digital Library, and you're probably the most prolific author on the other side of the digital library with the encyclopedia, sharing some of those stories that you've come across over the years. So what led to that? Is it the same impetus in terms of sharing interesting things, or?
Yes. I remember it had to have been maybe 1990 when Ken Burns was giving a lecture on a boiling hot day in a church in Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. My husband and I went, and I've never forgotten, he said that history is usually told about the important people. They get written about. He wants to do history from the bottom up. And that's how I feel. People, I remember having to help my son study for a test when he was in middle school, where he had to learn all the names of the conquistadors in South America and all of this. And I thought, what a waste. Let's teach it another way. Why don't you teach it with stories about these people? And so anyway, it's the little people that usually don't get written about. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write about a postmistress from Mount Holly, mm-hmm. or, a bridge maker, or what have you. I just wanted to bring people's stories to life, and other people could enjoy them.
Yeah.
And again, George Gardner. I've been a volunteer for the Historical Society for about 50 years, and he was very. He really wanted to push making our information available for people. But I thought with the Gardner Encyclopedia, when we had a meeting and with a group of us, and we were told about the idea of having a Gardner Library encyclopedia, and could we write some things about people? And, we started out writing about famous people.
Yeah.
And that's not where I wanted to go. So I've tried to get up to 150 Gardner articles for the 150th. I'm 3 short.
Oh.
So I got to get this.
Well, and then, so was it your connection with the Historical Society that led you to be involved with some of the countywide celebrations as well? Or how did you find yourself sort of, because if I remember correctly, you were involved with the Whiskey Rebellion?
Yes.
As well as the County 250?
Yes. When I found out, there's a sign, there was a historic marker in town that said in 1794, George Washington came here. And I moved back to Carlisle in 1793. In 1993, after I was divorced. And I thought, well, who's going to be celebrating the 200th anniversary of this event in Carlisle? And I found out nobody was. So I thought, well, I'll do it through the society, which backed us, and we got a big group. And Wayne Powell, the editor of the newspaper, and he got people. And it was a grand celebration. And then as far as the 250th, that I thought was rather funny, how I got to be the director. The county commissioners had a meeting here. Linda Whitmore was the director at that time, with several interested people, including me. And they said, In 2000, we're going to have a 250th anniversary of the county. And everybody said, oh, yes, that's good. Yes, we'd like to help. And then somebody said, well, when was the county created? And everybody looked around and I said, January 27th, 1750. Boom, I got it.
Yeah.
You know, they said, well, if you know when it was founded, why didn't you be in charge? So I was. And oh my gosh, that was a year-long celebration. So many, many people came on the board and helped with that.
Yeah.
And I guess that's how I ended up being the chairman of the 150th for the Historical Society. But the Historical Society has been a great part of my life.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of that, if we go back a little bit in time, so you were you mentioned already that you were doing the genealogy workshops, and then something that happened before my time as well was the antique forum.
Oh yes. I'm so sorry that we don't have lots of photographs of those. When we did the photo book for the 150th anniversary, I realized we have maybe 3 photos, but the Antiques Forum covered 20 years, I believe. They were headed really by the troika of the Historical Society at that time. P.K. Miller, Ann Hoffer, and Milton Flower. And through the Lafons, and Ed Lafond had been in the program at Winter Tour and knew so many people. And it's with all these connections that we were able every year to get the most distinguished speakers here in Carlisle to speak on various topics over the years. We'd have a 2 or 3 day forum and a dinner. Peter Siebert, I think, was our curator at that time, during some of that time. But people like Israel Sack, Maury Heckscher, the head of the American collection at the Metropolitan Museum, the heads of Colonial Jamestown, Colonial Williamsburg, the Diggs, Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller, Folk Art Center. It was just a wonderful experience and a gift to the people. And again, that at that time, 18th century antiques were the thing during the 80s and the early 90s.
Now, were you involved with a lot of? No, you didn't come onto the board until a little bit later,
yes.
In '89. But during that time period, were you, I guess, interacting with a lot of the people, sort of not necessarily the staff, but the board, or like those individuals like P.K. Miller and Milton Flower and Ann Hoffer?
When we moved back to Carlisle, my husband's law practice, my children were growing up. I was in the junior league.
Okay.
So you were required to do a lot of volunteer work. And of course, you had to do it in York County. And with young children, I did genealogy professionally. And so I kept coming to Carlisle for that.
Okay.
But I wasn't volunteering like I had been before and like I have been after. But I never lost my connection with the society.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if you had stories of Milton and PK and Jonas Worrell and
that I can tell here. No. Yeah, yes, but I would have to think about that.
Okay.
I have stories about having cocktails with Jane Mansfield, or dancing at the French Embassy on Bastille Day, but those don't have anything to do with the Historical Society.
So I know working with you that, and obviously, we discussed already the a lot of the sort of transcribing and indexing the original records, and I know all of your works are indexed, which again makes them super useful. So did that, at least for your own work, did that start because of the Wing project, the reproduction, or?
Well, no, yes. Was that before I did that? Yes, it really
That was
did
in
start with the Wing
yeah.
project. I remember sitting at my desk and looking out at a lilac bush come into flower and then fade as I took my index card. But it paid for a trip to England.
Oh, okay.
In fact, index cards were the bane of my children for several years. Well, we belonged to a local pool, and when the kids wanted to go to the pool, I didn't want to swim. I just took my index cards with me, which I know embarrassed them. Oh, Mother, why do you have to? I took them to the beach one time, down to Stone Harbor. Anyway, anything else?
Well, so that was 82. So was that who? So how did you get involved with that project then?
Which project?
The Wing reproduction.
As I said, we had a group of historians, Dr. Gates, Robert Christ, and they decided that we should reprint Wings and make some money, obviously. And I don't know how they chose me instead of John Fraley's. He has to be the index king of the world.
Yes.
But anyway, I was glad to do it. And again, all of these things helped me learn about local history.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I'm really interested in village life around the turn of the century and been doing some articles about that.
Yeah. Well, so what made, I guess, how did you come to join the board originally in '89?
I still remember that phone call. Yeah. I was standing in the kitchen, where the only phone in the house at that time, and I got a call from, I think it was Mary Hertzler. And she said, I'm calling from the nominating committee, and I'd like to know if you'd like to be on the board. Well, I was so happy. Actually, I was having tea with a good friend of mine at home when the phone rang and she called. And I remember going back to my tea table and talking to my friend about how I'd been involved in the Historical Society so many years and I'd always wanted to be on the board, but never asked. So I was thrilled. And I did become the president in 1995 for a year. But that was the last time I was on the board until 2 years ago.
I was going to say too, because I'm trying to think, is Mary Wheeler King was the first female president or board member. I'm blanking on when that was. I know Ann Hoffer was the first female president.
Yes.
Sometime, I think in the 80s.
Yes.
And then, yeah, so I guess at that point, more and more women were being asked. And
I keep following Ann Hoffer around. She got the Molly Pitcher Award. Yeah. And eventually, because of the 250th anniversary, I got the Molly Pitcher Award that year. And she was the museum chairman for years. Yep. And now I'm the museum chairman and she's on the committee. So we just keep tag teaming each other.
Yeah.
Right. She has a great love for the society.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think the Historical Society has been very blessed over the years to have a number of people
Yeah.
who have felt that way about us, including yourself. And because I can't imagine, yeah, we've mentioned John Fralish, his name a couple times. The amount of work that he's put in, indexing and transcribing all these records that just make life so much easier for the staff and patrons. And yeah.
One thing that I like to mention is that I've been volunteering for the last couple of years in the photo archives.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love working with Richard.
Yep.
And I'm processing. I don't do input or scanning. I do the processing and putting into folders of the photos. And again, this is just a wonderful way to get ideas. With the Gardner, you like to have photos with the stories. And because of this, if I see an interesting photo, I think, oh, I would like to do some research on this and write a story about maybe the people who lived here. And I'm going to be so sorry, I already am, to see Richard retire.
Yes. As I think both Karen and I and a number of other people will be as well.
Yes. So hopefully, I mentioned my age because I never mind mentioning my age to people, as a lot of women don't want to. But my mother died. I was at my mother's bedside when she died the day before her 44th birthday. And as I grew up and got older, I always wondered, would I die in my 40s? So I have no compunction about telling anybody how old I am because I'm amazed that I'm still here.
Yeah.
So hopefully I have another good 5 years or so, and I'll just keep on volunteering and writing for the Historical Society.
Well, I should ask too. So you mentioned that you moved to York, I'm assuming. What year was that?
Let's see, the flood.
So 72?
He graduated the year of the flood, and they worked, he and his best friend, Elliot Strokoff, who was an attorney, worked for the commission that gave out loans in Harrisburg. And so as soon as I think it's 72 that we left for York, and I did not, move back to Carlisle till 93.
Okay. So you were doing a lot of this, the genealogy workshops and,
Yes.
all this while living in York.
Yes.
Okay. Did you do a lot of things? So what made you decide to remain at CCHS instead of with the York County Historical Society that your father-in-law was involved with?
I did take clients and that had York families. I never volunteered there to do anything. I just did genealogy there. And it was always fun because we used the money that I made for genealogy to go on family trips.
Yep.
So that was always fun. But I have to tell you, I never got to feel at home in York County. And when I would drive from my house to Carlisle, there was a wooden post. It's right after where you turn off to go to Ashcombs, the Williams Grove Road. There was a wooden post that said Cumberland County. And I'd always high-five it when I drove by because I always felt like I was going home when I passed that marker. And that's why I've never left here. My friends are here. My background and history's here.
Well, I don't know if this is a question that you should answer, but I know I've heard stories from a friend of yours, Barb Landis,
yes,
that when she worked here, or when she started, and this would have been the 80s, I suppose. That because you mentioned smoking in the old courthouse.
Yes.
And I know there are stories of smoking at the front desk of the Historical Society. So is that also something that was quite prevalent, or?
I don't remember anybody actually smoking at the front desk,
Okay.
but we'd go into what's now just outside Town Hall. That was the kitchen.
Okay.
And Linda Whitmer, the director, she smoked. And I quit smoking when I was 40, actually. But that's where we smoked. Yes.
Because the stories that I heard were the receptionist would put her cigarette on the desk, and I guess there are all these burn marks from. But yeah.
I'm sure Barb's right. I don't remember that.
Okay.
But I have one story to tell about Barb since
Sure.
you told that. When I did the 250th, I'm sure it was Barb's suggestion that we do a powwow because she was really involved in research on the Indian school. And so we had a committee, and one of the members was he's a school teacher who lived near Chambersburg, and he had been adopted into an Indian tribe. And the tribe said that if we were going to do a powwow, which we did it on the War College grounds, the first and only time it's ever been held there, that Barb and I had to go to a sweat lodge and purify ourselves. Well, so one day we drove out to his house, and he had been preparing rocks on the fire for hours, and he had built a lodge with blankets and tarps and everything. You can't have any light or any smoke go out. And little did I know what we were getting into. But as the chairman of the 250th, I felt I had to do it. So Barb and I prepared ourselves. We went into the sweat lodge. Barb had not taken her contacts out. What is done in a sweat lodge is you have prayer flags, and you take water in a gourd and you bring it in, and then you pour it over the heated rocks, and all the steam comes up. And I remember that he said, if anybody put a towel over your head to sort of keep the steam away a little, and if anybody has to go out, there was a certain thing that you needed to say, and you could leave the sweat lodge. One of the people brought their 8-year-old daughter into the sweat lodge. And it wasn't long after the whole thing started that I thought, I think I'm going to faint or have a heart attack. Oh my, I'm the chairman of the 250th. I have to stay alive. So when the little girl's mother said she needs to go out, then I asked to go out too. Well, I sat outside for the next hour on a tree stump, and I listened to what went on in the small lodge, and every once in a while they'd come out and have to get more water or something. And pretty soon I noticed these bees circling around me. And then pretty soon I was getting stung. And then pretty soon the sweat lodge people came out, and we raced down to his house so that I could put something on my bee stings on my rear end. And Barb could, to make a long story short, we had to drive back to Carlisle from Gettysburg. Barb couldn't drive. We had driven in a car, but she couldn't drive because her eyes were all from the sweat lodge. And I had to drive like this because I'd been stung. We were quite a pair that came back to Carlisle, but we did it, and that powwow was memorable.
Yep.
And I'll never forget that one of the people in the dance said to me, those children in that cemetery, it's the first time they've ever heard the drum.
Mm.
And I've never forgotten that. That was a really meaningful experience.
We covered a lot. I think we got everything that you have on your notes.
Yes.
But I always ask, is there anything that I should have delved more into, or anything else that you want to mention, or something that you're now thinking of, or?
I'm sure I'll think of it when I go home.
That's usually how it goes, but
yes.
I try and ask now to.
But I guess I'd like to say how much the staff should be appreciated for everything that they do.
Yeah.
They don't just come to work. You're all passionately interested in the history of the county and your jobs. And I'm speaking as a board member, not just as a volunteer or whatever, that it's really appreciated. So I plan to be here until a truck runs me over or something.
Well, hopefully that's many years from now, because again, I've said it multiple times throughout this conversation, but the work that you've done is so, appreciated by me, by Kara, the rest of the staff, and a lot of the patrons, because, people come in, we pull out books with your name on them, and we can, and all the work that, someone is planning on doing is already done, and they can go and they see the sources, and they can go, if they want to, pull those original tavern licenses or deeds, and it's just, or the tax list and all that stuff. So it's just,
thank you.
It's great. Well, thank you for talking. And again, if something does pop up, or you want to cover the last 24 years, feel free to let me know.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.